right, welcome back everyone here to the ADSA. Joining me for this session as my co-host is Dr. Jeff Elliott. Jeff's a technical support person here at Balchem Corporation. Our guest here for this session is Dr. Eduardo Ribeiro from Guelph and his student Matheus Santos. Matheus, I guess you did a poster today. Dr. Ribeiro, would you mind introducing Matheus for us?
Yeah, of course, of course. First, thank you so much, Scott and Jeff, for having us. It's a great pleasure to be here and participate in this podcast and conversation.
Absolutely.
And Matheus, so we're working at Guelph in the Animal Biosciences Department. Matheus is a master's student in the lab. He's close to the end. He's finishing this summer and has generated a lot of interesting data during the last 2 years. And is focusing a lot on the prepartum period and how that can affect things in the early postpartum period. And I'll let him do the conversation here.
Yeah, no, sounds good. Before we get started, I should have asked you to maybe introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you and what you do there at Guelph.
Of course, yeah. So I'm originally from Brazil. I did vet school in Brazil, and then I moved to University of Florida to do a Master of Science and PhD, working with José Santos.
José, of course, yeah.
And when I was finished the PhD, there was an open position in Guelph that fits really well with what I had done so far, and decided to apply. Got the position there in 2016. I started as an assistant professor, and it's been great to be in Guelph. There's a lot of great colleagues there, and a very interesting industry around us that support us in the Dairy Guelph program. So it's been really good. Most of my research is on the reproduction of dairy cows, but over the years, I start to see the importance of health and nutrition on reproduction, and then I start to do more and more transition work, a little bit of nutrition, and train with José.
Yeah.
You kind of get a bit dangerous in those areas as well. So, so that's how we work today in transition management, animal health and reproduction. And Matheus specifically is more focused on the transition management and health.
Good. Well, Guelph's got a good one. Thank you for joining us today. Matheus, why don't you tell us a little bit about your research study that you did?
Okay, so as Dr. Ribeiro just said, I've been working with transition dairy cows, specifically looking at prepartum dry matter intake. So I think it's quite exciting because last year at the ADSA I had the opportunity to present a different poster that we're looking at the magnitude of decline in prepartum dry matter intake. And it's kind of widely known that like dairy cows have depressed dry matter intake during the last weeks of gestation, and that directly impacts their postpartum health. And we're interested in better exploring this and see which one is more important, like the drop of feed intake that the cows undergo during the last 3 weeks of prepartum, or keeping a low or a high level of dry matter intake during the last 6 weeks of gestation. And that's what we brought this year. So we were looking at the level of prepartum dry matter intake during the last few weeks of gestation. You're looking at how it impacts on the transition cows, like metabolism and also performance. And I think we got some quite interesting results.
Go ahead, explain some of those results to us. We talked this morning, but just give us a quick overview, what you found.
Yeah, sure. So basically we are working with a data set from 273 cows from a research dairy farm. So we have data information, feed intake for all these cows, plus several blood metabolites at different time points. So we were interested, as I said, looking at the prepartum dry matter intake. So we classified cows in low, moderate, or high level of prepartum dry matter intake. And then we in fact saw that these cows with a low level of prepartum dry matter intake, they start having this low dry matter intake 6 weeks before they give birth. And even after parturition, they still have a low feed intake compared to cows that had a high level of prepartum feed intake. And that was quite interesting as well because we saw there during the prepartum cows that were eating less, they were heavier, they had a greater body condition score, which is reflecting they're like fatter compared to the other cows, to the other groups. And also we saw that these cows, they differed for like their energy balance. Quite interesting, in the last week prepartum, we saw that cows with a low level dermal intake, they even reached like a negative energy balance, which did not happen to the other two groups. We also saw that like after calving, they had like the most severe negative energy balance, and we also saw some like reflect on that, like on those blood biomarkers. And
Yeah, I would encourage the audience to look at that energy balance drop because it was dramatic. But what do you think is the implication of that?
yeah, I think it's a good question. It's a result of like lower feed intake and also greater body weight. So that's why they had like the less negative, the less positive energy balance. And there has a lot of implications that might be even started like during the prepartum before giving birth. So negative energy balance can lead to like immunosuppression and then subsequently to development of clinical disease. Even though we did not assess like disease prevalence in this study, we saw that cows with a low level of dermal intake, they also had low rumination time during the prepartum, which is quite nice because then we can see like how we can use this behavioral data, the sensors, to try to find a way to see these cows that are like undergoing a low level feed intake and try to establish like some protocols to avoid the consequences, because we saw, for example, that during the transition they had higher concentrations of NIFA, of BHB. We also saw that cows with a low level of dermal intake, they had like a low activity of superoxide dismutase, which is an antioxidant, and like plays an important role in controlling like oxidative stress in transition cows. So, and also we found that these cows have like lower albumin, which is like a negative marker of inflammation. So I think it's quite interesting to.
Yeah, Matheus has a lot of data on those animals, and he's using some interesting methods to try to understand a little bit better what regulates feed intake prepartum, because when you look at the literature, we don't understand that very well. So when you try to explain dry matter intake with the variables we have, it's very small percentage that we explain. So a lot of that variability we don't know where it comes from. And another interesting point from the industry is that people have this notion that prepartum dry matter intake will be important for postpartum health, but in general people think about this drop, right? And that's what the first study that Matheus presented last year looked at. And it seems to be relevant, that drop. But people forget that before the drop, there's a certain level of intake that is also important, and apparently even more important than just the drop. And those two things, they are not very correlated. So you have cows that are eating well and they drop a lot, some don't drop much. You have cows that not eating much and they still drop close to parturition, others don't. So there's a lot happening, and I think the two studies that Matheus did help us to understand a little bit more the implications that it has for the transition metabolism and the performance of those animals later on. And I would challenge Matheus to comment a little bit about his third study, which is in commercial farms.
Oh yeah,
So,
that's nice. And just like mention one more thing about this two previous study. As Eduardo said, like most people have been giving attention to this decline in dry matter intake. And in that first study, we found out that there was like no effect on milk production for cows that have like a large decline in dry matter intake compared to cows that had a moderate decline, or cows that had like a more stable prepartum dry matter intake. And in the second study that I just presented this year at the ADSA, we found out that cows with a low level prepartum dry matter intake, they in fact undergo some like consequence of milk production. So they produce less milk, and also they produce less energy-correcting milk over the first 14 weeks of lactation.
And that was at a commercial
No,
farm?
no, this
That's
is
still
The second one.
the second one.
still on the research farm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Talking about the another trial that we did on a commercial farm. Unfortunately, feed intake is not something feasible to be measured in a commercial farm. So we are trying to explore and like use like this sensor data, like rumination time and activity, and see how we can like leverage this data to identify groups of cows that are like in high risk of developing postpartum disease. So in this first and the second study that I just mentioned that was conducted at the research station, we saw those cows undergoing like the large drop in feed intake and also having a low level of prepartum feed intake. They ruminate less during the last week prior to parturition. And then we are looking at the rumination, that interval, and also classifying cows into like tertiles and see how like they are transitioning. And quite interesting, in this third study, we found out these cows are like ruminating less during the last week. They undergo more inflammation because we found out like higher levels of haptoglobin, lower levels of albumin. And in this case, it was also quite nice because we could look at the incidence of disease, and we found that for multiparous cows, cows that ruminate less in the last week, they had higher incidence of clinical disease, uterine disease, non-uterine disease, multiple subclinical disorders as well. So that was quite interesting.
So there's still a lot of unknowns, but how would you take this to a nutritionist and apply it on a dairy? What would be your take-home message?
Well, I think there's so many approaches that we can take it because it is still important to avoid cows having that drop in dry matter intake, but looking at like the producer perspective, keeping them at a high level during the prepartum seems to be more important because we saw difference in milk production in that second study. And also, if you are able to identify these cows with a low level of feed intake, looking at rumination, prepartum rumination data and other data as well, and if you can propose like an intervention that we can kind of prevent these cows undergoing through that like impaired metabolism and maybe the consequence milk production. That will be another approach. And also in terms of nutrition, if we can work with like supplements which have like more like antioxidant properties or like inflammatory properties. Also working with approaches where you can increase, improve the feed intake and encourage cows to eat more. So I think there's multiple approaches. What do you think, Eduardo?
No, I think you did. You answered very well, Matheus. So definitely promoting that feed intake prepartum seems to be important, and we know a little bit of what controls feed intake prepartum, but one that we know that has an effect is body conditioning score. So avoiding those fat cows, a dry off is also important. And in the future, hopefully, we'll be able to develop some tests to classify cows in high risk and low risk of postpartum problems, and then at that stage we can propose some new interventions.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
An important topic indeed, and I want to thank you guys for joining us today. This has been quite enlightening. Appreciate all the hard work you're doing. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.